Coming up this week on the TDL Show 940, we're going to be talking about wavetables, audio wavetables, wavetables in synthesis, all sorts, with wavetable expert Keith Crosley, and he's going to be joining us. Before that, we'll have a quick chat about some comments from last week's show. I mentioned about a new collection I've got for the Modwave and new build of Windows 11 as well. But anyway, packed show, let's get straight to Gary. Gary, good evening.
Good evening.
And we've got another different but really fascinating show this week.
Oh yeah, really fascinating.
So Keith Crosley is going to be joining us, talking about wavetables, AI-generated wavetables that brings maths computing together into audio to produce sounds that make soundscapes, that make dubstep music. It's quite.
He is a wavetable magician, isn't he?
Yeah, he's probably the leading wavetable generator in the world, and we've got him on the show. So if you're interested in how sounds made, then Keith's going to explain the difference between wavetables, sampling, and all that kind of stuff. But we'll go to Keith shortly. Just want to catch up on a couple of notes just before we dive into that. Last week we talked about Android the Android subsystems being removed from Windows 11 on last week's show, and we did get a comment in from Michael, who said two things. He said, we talked about OneDrive and the ability to remove OneDrive. Why does anybody what would need to do that? And he said two things. You would remove OneDrive for privacy reasons, not necessarily performance, which is supposed to be a fair comment.
Yeah.
I would probably just say you don't need to put your documents in those. You can set it up so you don't need to, but it is fair. You could have that. And regarding the Android subsystem, he says it's not so really much as developers as the Android SDK as the emulators need. Whereas the Amazon App Store is not available for everybody. In my country, Denmark, you cannot use the Android subsystem because the Amazon Store is not available here. I think we'll see more features in the link to Windows app running Android app on native by the phone and Windows box, as that has got much more use.
Yeah, there's something to be said for that. I mean, and he's right. I mean, the Amazon App Store was always a limitation of it because it wasn't available worldwide. Yeah, it's a good point.
And the link to Windows Android app is getting better. You can run things. It's still got some limitations, and you still need a device to run them on. But yeah, that is, I think, where Microsoft are going with Windows to make Android apps work well on it is by using that method. So it's fair point. We did have a new build last week, so I've got a build video of that 26080. There's not a huge amount in there, but definitely check that out. And I have got a new video of a new sound collection for the Korg Modwave. So this does use some wavetables, not as many as Keith has done, but this is a set of sound inspired by late 80s digital synths like the Korg M1, the Ensoniq VFX, the D50 and the Yamaha SY 1977. So these were sort of the sounds that you would hear in the later 80s. So we've moved away from the sort of the big analog Jupiter 8 type synths into that later 80s stuff. So used a lot of pop music. So I've got those sounds in a new collection. So there's about 50 performances and 20 odd programs you can use in that combine that sort of digital sound with analog sounds that were being recreated there. So you've got sort of bells and layers of vocals, and you'll recognize the sounds when you hear them. But anyway, there's a free collection available from thedigitalifestyle.com and the YouTube video to go with that as well. So a sneak preview for my next one I'm going to be working on. Think Vangelis. That's all I'll say.
Oh, wow.
I've been listening to a lot of Vangelis this last week or so. Right, So let's get straight to Keith. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ian. Good evening your time.
Yeah, good evening or good afternoon your time. So we're going to be talking some really interesting stuff tonight. Wavetables, bring them into synths, all the kind of things you can do with it. We're quite a technical show normally, so this is ideal for us because it's like computers meet music, meet sampling, and it all converges on it. So I'm going to ask you about what wavetables are, what you do with them, what kind of sounds you get, and how you can use them today in synths, and how we can get hold of the wavetables that you've created lots of. before that though, just give us a bit about yourself and tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Keith Crosley, and in my non-musical, non-sound design life, I'm a digital marketing guy. So I work on websites and search engine optimization, and low code and no code development is part of what I do, working with things like Bubble. But sonically, like I've been a synth programmer, probably like you, Ian, since like the 1980s. My first synth was a Casio CZ101 when that was a new instrument. And I've been involved in sound design, and media production is part of marketing. And so as part of my job, I do a lot of video and audio editing and creation and production and things like that. And I've long been involved with different kinds of synthesizers, like back in the back before the interweb as we know it today. I was on a lot of mailing lists about synthesizers that I had. Like I was into the Ensoniq samplers, and then so like the EPS 16 Plus and the ASR that came after that. And then and so I did a lot of stuff like with that mailing list, like met a lot of interesting people in that space. And then I also did a lot of stuff with Nord Modular, and then the E4 series of samplers. So I used to have, like, I have old sites. Now they're just part of the Internet Archive, where all that work was. And so lately, though, I've been getting into really deep, you could maybe call it oscillator design, by doing this giant collection of wavetables that I sell commercially. There's also a free version available, but these are all at wavetables.lol. That's wavetables.lol. And it's literally, I think it's the largest collection of wavetables that anyone's ever made. So it's more than 140,000 wavetables now. And so I think it might be safe to say that I am the human being that has made the most wavetables of anybody ever. And of course, those aren't assembled by hand. You have to do that with scripting. But I think it's an achievement. And that's kind of me.
Interesting. We'll talk about the wavetables in a sec. Just a couple of things you said there. So that was like the Yahoo groups and things that I used to be a part of.
Like old listserv groups and stuff. Yeah. I mean, it was so weird, right? Because you get a daily digest of like questions, that people have, and then like you'd write to the email server, right? And people would get that like in non-real time. But you could, starting about the EMU 4 days, like you could start to attach things. And so, I would post like little short sample sets, to those lists and things, which is kind of interesting. But all of those, I don't know if I still have those samples. Like they're probably like on the original discs, and like on SciJet drives. Or actually, I guess they still exist. They're like inside my E4K. I still have my E4K because it was a beautiful instrument. I don't know if you ever saw those, but for the time, it had a lot of hands-on control because it actually had 4 sliders. It had 4 sliders and an extra button, and a pitch bend and a mod wheel. And so that was like the height of luxury. And then a 76 key keyboard that looked like a Steinway. Like they did a little joke with it. They put a red felt strip, just like a Steinway, and then they ripped off the Steinway logo and it said emulator on it. It's a beautiful instrument, and it's built like a tank, so it still exists, but it's too big for my San Francisco apartment. So it's in storage, and every now and then I take it out and do stuff with it. But anyway,
I had
old sampling was so fun.
Yeah, I had an Ensoniq Mirage, which I got really cheap because it was probably the mid 90s when they were kind of, nobody really wanted them. And I had it for about 4 or 5 years and never really got on with it, and then sold it. And I wish I'd kept it now because I think now I'd probably get into it. But yeah, that was on with the floppy disks on it. But I used to do sampling on my ZX Spectrum originally. That was 8-bit sampling on the Spectrum.
So not to turn this into the old guy computer music show, But that probably the very first like computer audio thing I probably did was I on my Apple II, I actually turned it into a sampler. It actually had an audio input right for the cassette, and it turned out that you could sample from that. And so it's like somewhere I have 5¼ inch floppy disks with with like very short samples that are like they're literally 1 bit, you know, because all you could do is detect that the waveform changed, but you could do it fast enough that I don't know, you maybe get like 26 kilohertz out of it or something. Pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, well, the Apple II there were really good sample stuff for it, wasn't there? And used by a lot of professional musicians.
Yeah, there are lots of those add-in cards and stuff for it.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, I mean, I could derail. So we could just talk about the '80s if you wanted to, but
yeah,
that's probably boring for a lot of your audience.
But, well, this is something we talk about. Retro computing is something we often talk about. Yeah, at a Spectrum. Gary, you were on those big magnetic drive things as your computers, weren't you?
Well, yeah. Well, I actually predate that. I mean, I was paper tape and punch card way back. But, drum drives and things that. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
So I want to talk about wavetabling.
Yeah.
And wavetabling and sampling. So I guess most people are familiar with sampling. Just explain to what sampler is and why wavetabling is different.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, well, of course, there's different sorts of instruments and different sorts of both hardware and software synthesizers, right? And sampling is when we take a digital audio recording, right? And then we play it back at different pitches, and we can, basically use that audio recording, which the sample, as an oscillator, right, in a synthesizer. Now, wavetable synthesis is a kind of a subset of sampling. So in a wavetable synthesizer, the oscillator part of the synth is powered by a wavetable. And a wavetable is simply a collection of single cycle waveforms that are basically concatenated together. And these synthesizers can play back those. They are essentially audio samples. In modern ones, they're about 2048 samples in length. It can play those back as if it were an oscillator. So you can have a wavetable that, is, say, a sawtooth wave, and you morph that sawtooth wave like down to a sine wave, right? And that would actually sound like the same kind of effect we get if we had an analog or a digital filter and we filtered out all the harmonics of the sawtooth wave until we got a sine, right? And so that was kind of the genesis of the idea for wavetable synthesis, because I think the very first commercial wavetable synthesizer would have been the first version of the PPG Wave, and that there was very few of those. I think that's one of those things, they were all custom built for people. But that didn't have
Tangerine Dream and
I think Tangerine Dream,
Dolby.
Dolby had. I think Dolby maybe had the one with filters. He might have had all of them.
Mm-hmm.
But that first version, at that time, right, CPU power is very limited, and it was kind of a miracle that we could even do digital audio playback at all. But you definitely couldn't do digital modeling of filters. And so the idea with wavetables originally was a lot like, I mentioned the Casio CZ101. So it was a little like phase distortion synthesis and a little like FM synthesis, right, that Yamaha pioneered. Because while you could generate audio, you couldn't really model a filter digitally. So you needed to come up with methods that would let you go from something with a high number of harmonics to a low number of harmonics and kind of simulate filtering in that way. And so that's kind of the genesis of it. But today, there are, and I feel like there's been a resurgence in the past few years in the interest in wavetable synthesis, partly driven by Serum, which is a very popular soft synth that's, kind of famous in the like dubstep community, right? So there's a lot of sounds that are made with wavetable synthesis that are, kind of tropes or commonly heard sounds in certain kinds of bass and dance music. So I don't know if I'm long and talky, as I say in my videos, and so I might prattle on
That's okay.
But I don't know if I answered the question right. But that's
right.
That's a basic of wavetable synthesis, right? And then so on top of that, so today, we can digitally model filters, and digitally modeled filters are just as good as analog filters. There are some that do not sound any different. There are in fact ones that that almost perfectly emulate the behavior of analog filters. It's quite remarkable now. But so now wavetable synthesis has kind of grown to it's more like subtractive synthesis. So you've got an oscillator, but you also will have either analog filters or digitally modeled filters that you can then apply to those sounds. The cool thing about wavetables is that, of course, we can generate like not only the basic synthesis waveforms, right? Like your square, your sawtooth, your triangle, and your sine, but they can be a lot more complex. And so that's what I've been doing. Like I generate a lot of the waveforms in my collection are generated using various like mathematical series. And so they have lots of different harmonics. And so you can generate those, and you could have a wavetable that's actually like all, more harmonic material. Then you're going to filter it later, with a digital filter, or in like luxury instruments like that groove synthesis third wave. It's almost like a modern recreation of the PPG that did have analog filters. Like so that thing marries both digital and analog filters and a wavetable oscillator. So that's what that's about. And then Ian, you've been doing a lot of stuff with Modwave, which is actually kind of why I started making my own wavetables, because even though I'd had Serum for a really long time, I never really like got into it. It's just like one of those things you sort of have to have. But when I got Modwave, I was like, oh boy, this is like such a great synthesizer architecture, and it's been getting easier and easier to create your own wavetables. And so I just really got into that. And partly how that happened is my COVID synth was a wave state, because I had moved, my wife and I had moved down to our place in Palm Springs, during lockdown days, after it became safe-ish to do so. And I didn't have any of my studio equipment there. Like I maybe had a couple audio interfaces. I didn't have any synthesizers. And I was like, I'm going to go nuts if I don't have something to play with. And Wave State had come out a while back. And I'm like, oh, that looks really interesting. And so I got into that. And it's, it's kind of a laptop synth, right? I different from a lot of people. I think a lot of people like have an issue with the form factor of those Korg synths, the Op6 and the Wave State and the Modwave. But like, I like that little, it's a Chinsi keyboard.
Yeah.
The action's not great.
It's like great. It works well. Yeah.
Well, they're light as air, but they're still pretty sturdy. And so I just like, put it on my lap, and then you can program the thing. Right. So like that. So I got into that. And then that led into Dan Phillips noticed me in some of the forums. And I think he even kind of knew who I was from like back in the day. And he was like, hey, do you want to be a beta tester? And so I got access to Wave State Native, and also the sample builder, like before anybody else did, as part of the beta program. And since I'm super into sampling, I was really into Sample Builder, and that's probably like the only thing I reported bugs on. I was like, okay, like I had all these issues and improvements for Sample Builder, and then so when Modwave became available, I got a Modwave, and then I was part of the Korg beta program for Modwave, and in the same way that I really focused on like the guts of the instrument, I was like, oh yeah, well let's build new wavetables.
And so typically, what would you say the sound of a wavetable could be? So I can recognize a square wave or a sawtooth wave, or a pulse wave. Wavetables don't tend to be that. What if could you give sort of audio, what examples of what you would hear of a wavetable? Yeah.
So well, traditionally wavetable synthesis, and what's unique about it is often associated with these kind of glassy timbres,
right?
Like really high harmonic stuff, like things that sound like sort of either bell-like or even like kind of inharmonic, and you have these glassy textures. And then people also associate, because of those early 8-bit and 12-bit hardware wavetable synths, they kind of associate with a little bit of sort of digital conversion grit and stuff like that. So they sort of associate with the early sound of sampling in a way. But a wavetable can technically contain any sort of sound. Again, it's just the single cycle waveform, right? So traditionally you're either looking at like 256 samples in that waveform or 2048 in more modern instruments. And so, there's only so much you can do. So like a wavetable synthesizer, if we're not modulating the wavetable position, that is, if we're not morphing between the different waveforms in the wavetable, they have a completely static sound. So, you're just going to hear that oscillator, whether it sounds like a bell or whether it sounds buzzy or nasal, like a pulse wave. There won't be any timbral change happening in it, which is different, right, from an audio sample of, say, a choir or something, right? Like that would be a second or multiple seconds long, and then it might be looped or it might be not. So they can't capture that change, but as you modulate wavetable position, you can morph between those waveforms. And like earlier wavetable synths, they could just go between those specific waves, and so that might be jarring unless those waveforms are very, very similar to each other. But in more modern synthesizers, and this is like anything from the 90s on, generally a wavetable synth will interpolate between those individual waveforms inside the wavetable, which we call frames, by the way. And so between frames, what it'll do is it'll typically do like a linear interpolation between the shape of the first waveform and the shape of the next one. And so you can get these completely smooth transitions now. One thing that's kind of interesting, so one thing that you can't really model with a wavetable synthesis is noise, right? Because noise has to be continuously random for us to hear it as noise. If we do take noise and we make it a waveform, we put it in a wavetable synthesizer, if we hold on that oscillator section, we won't hear it as noise anymore. We hear it as a timbre. And it just sounds like it sounds like a metallic timbre. So like with all synthesizers, right? Like a lot of novices to synthesis or synthesizer marketing people will be like, you can make any sound imaginable with this. There's no type of synthesis that can do that, right? Like the range of musical sound is too large to really be captured in any one instrument. But wavetables, I think, are like one of the more interesting techniques for synthesis that it's surprising. Like it gets explored and it is used, but there hasn't been a waveform nerd in a while, and so like I've kind of become the waveform nerd. I'm like, okay, let's explore that possible space. What are all the musically useful waveforms? And of course, it would take a very long time. There are more waveforms if even in a 32-bit integer waveform. Like there are more possible numeric values there than I think there are atoms in the universe. So the number of potential waveforms is actually too large to even be a meaningful number. And of course, most of them would be noise, right? But so the trick is to like find the interesting ones that exist in that huge space.
And it's funny how the technology's evolved and the trends or the taste for sounds have evolved. And so when like the PPG, you get, say, a choir sound, it was done in there because you couldn't sample a choir. There's not enough memory. Yeah. Then into the 90s, you got the Romplers and the M1s and D50s that could have a choir. But now we've kind of come full circle. I was playing with the PPG waves on the Modwave to try and make a choir. But it's a different sound. It's a difference, I suppose. A sample is like a photograph, and a wave is a living, breathing thing that you can twist and play with, and then use other inputs too, so velocity and envelopes and things to create something new.
Yeah, it's all about the modulation, really. It's funny that you mentioned that, and we could maybe try this. Dare I try to share my desktop audio? Because I do have Modwave Native running. So there was this thing.
Yeah, I can that's got
Yeah,
that
right.
sort of inhuman quality to it.
Yeah, it's very strange. So these are some of the next waveforms that are coming to the collection. And so again, there's like, I'll just show you. Let's see here. So there's like, there's every possible combination of vowels with the saw wave as the carrier. There's every possible combination of vowels with square wave as the carrier. And then I also did them with noise. This might sound really terrible. You can hear, so with noise, you see that as we hang on this last note, that's not noise anymore, it's a timbre. So that's the issue with noise. Anyway, let me I'll stop sharing now.
That's
okay.
That's amazing when you get those human sounds. They sound human, but they're not sampled. So
yeah,
it's got this sort of inhuman sort of sci-fi quality to it.
Yeah, and it's not a recording of a human voice either, right? Like they were completely mathematically generated, and even the filter part, like it's not an analog filter. It's not a hardware filter. It's a mathematically modeled filter. So that's the kind of like geeky stuff that I've been up to.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
It does. It's really amazing.
Yeah, I guess.
I'm glad you like that. Well, because you see, I've gotten a lot of I don't get a lot, but I get some complaints from people. Like some people that will get the collection, and I find it weird when people like will buy something and they haven't seen it or heard it. Like they don't even take the time to like look at my intro video to kind of understand what it's about. And they do sometimes have people going, well, where are all the dubstep growl wavetables? I'm like, there's enough dubstep growl wavetables out there. I don't need to do that. I don't need to explore that space. But I was starting to think, well, could we explore some of these subgenres, of dubstep, like color-based? Could I come up with waveforms that are cool for that? And so, a big thing that people are always doing, right, is in those genres, is there are these things called growls and things called yoinks that are kind of bandpass filtered or actually high pass filtered versions of complex waveforms. And because the filter has a high resonance on it, you get these things that kind of sound like a person talking, right? And I was like, well, why don't we just go direct to the source, and why don't we just make some wavetables that actually sound like vowels, right, and see how that could be used. So that's what that's part of.
Yeah.
But then I get people, right? Then I also get people who are like, well, all these things sound the same. Like I built these machine learning systems, variational autoencoders, that are trained on my original waveform collection, right? And then had them produce new wavetables and waveforms. And that created, like, there's tens of thousands of those wavetables. And people are like, well, these are kind of the same. And I'm like, well, it's a huge space. And yeah, I'm using like similar techniques. And so the exploration here is all about what are all the subtle differences that we can find between things. And so it is a little like crate digging, when you have that many wavetables. It's like, okay, well, what's this one going to sound like? But Modwave in particular makes it super easy to to navigate a really huge set of wavetables, right? Because they're searchable. You can put them into categories, and there doesn't actually on the Modwave native, the software version, there doesn't seem to be a limit for how many wavetables it can load, and you can still search them and sort them, like instantaneously. I've got something like 300,000 wavetables on this machine right now, and you saw that I typed in format, and it goes, here's all the format wavetables. So that's while there's many other things that recommend Modwave, that's like one of the more powerful features. Is that you can have an insanely huge database, and it doesn't break a sweat.
And so once you've got these wavetables in, you've got these files. You mentioned some can cross mod between, so wavetable 1 goes to 2 and to 3. Yeah. So do you kind of make them so that they have a certain sound when you sort of scrub through them?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a bunch of like different approaches. So at one level, a wavetable is basically arbitrary, right? So if you've got like a bunch of waveforms, you might just want to know, you might just want to do an experiment, right? It's like, okay, what does this bell-like timbre sound like when it morphs to a sawtooth wave, right? Um, and then if you've built, like I did, a collection originally of 29,000 waveforms, I was like, I'm never going to manually go into Serum, for example, which does have a good like wavetable building interface. I'm never going to find all the interesting things, right? It's like, because I've got 29,000 files. It's like, okay, I'm sort of picking one at random, and picking another one at random and then listening to those. It would be much better just to generate every possible wavetable from those, using some selection criteria and things like that, and then just load them all up and listen to them. So the collection started kind of with these arbitrary types of wavetables. You do get, so for example, I did some different waveform generation techniques, like things like bit masking. Like, let's set the number of harmonics in a waveform like based on this combination of 10 bits, okay? And so like if there's a 1 in the first position, that means it has the fundamental harmonic. And then if there's a 1 in the fourth position, that means that it'll have the fourth harmonic in a 1 over n relationship, things like that, right? And so you can generate, like, there's several thousand possible waveforms that can come out of that. You could just put them into a wavetable, but now they don't really have any relationship to each other. And so the next thing that I did was kind of selecting things at random and then sometimes sorting them by like their spectral brightness and things like that. More recently, as I'm getting deeper into new things, I am thinking about the construction of wavetables um, from kind of a mathematical or consistent point of view. Like, one of the best examples of this is I did a video recently that's about the Morlet wavelet. I guess it's more properly the Morlet wavelet, but this is a sinusoidal function that has a window over it. And they have a very distinct sound. They have this really cool like resonant sound. They're a little bit like a sawtooth or something like that. But they're very unique. But you can take that equation that makes the Morlet waveform, and you can over time do things like adjust the width of the window, and then you could adjust the frequency of the sinusoid. And so that kind of makes sense, right? And so you can pick different values, and then you could generate a wavetable where those things smoothly morph between each other. And so that's the thing that I've been doing lately. So I made a huge collection. Well, there's about 80 of those wavetables, but then I did some stuff with like Bezier curves based on my look at Zebralet 3, which is kind of a new. I don't know if you checked that out yet, Ian, but it's free and it's interesting. It's from the guys at Yuhi, and it uses a different. It doesn't use a sample-based wavetable. Its oscillator is actually like spline-based, and so instead of like morphing between audio frames, it morphs between shapes, and so it has this really weird, different sound. But it's also a little like using Illustrator or AutoCAD. It's very strange. It's a strange approach, but it gives like completely unique results. So I was like, oh well, curves are an interesting idea, and so then I generated, I did wavetables where we generate one Bezier curve and then we generate a different Bezier curve, again with kind of random control points and stuff, but then smoothly morph between those. And like that gives a completely different effect than it would be if you just, if you just had a 2-frame wavetable where you started with one Bezier curve and then, let the Modwave linearly morph between them. It's a completely different sound than the way that the curves actually change over time if you compute them out in advance. So I don't know what your question was. Yeah. I just went off on a rant about, but that's how I'm thinking about them. So another way that I encourage people to use the types of things that I've created is that I do like in Modwave, and this is kind of unique. I don't think there's any other wavetable synthesizer that has this, but each oscillator, it's not just limited to one wavetable, but it's got that A/B mode. And so you can have a wavetable in slot A, and a wavetable in slot B, and then you can morph between those. So not only can you morph, it's like a 4-dimensional morph, right? You can morph the position, what wavetable you're accessing, but then you can also morph the entire wavetable, and you can you can interpolate along that. So that you can take, like if you have, say, you could take a vocal type of wavetable, and then you could take like a basic synthesis wavetable, right? Something like those Bezier curves I was talking about, and you can smoothly morph them together. And that's like super interesting to do. And that's also a way of like taming a wavetable that's like super high frequency. There's a lot of wavetables in my collection that have a lot of bell-like timbres in them. But if you just, if you put it in AB mode, and then you kind of sometimes go to that higher frequency wavetable, or you do some sort of, smooth morph with an envelope or an LFO, you can get like entirely new sounds, right? So that's something that I try to educate people about when I do my YouTube videos.
Yeah, I like the AB. I've used that for a few things, and also you can even use it to go have the same waveform with an offset, so you can kind of go between two multiple points. That
AB offset is cool. The other thing is the modifiers can be different for the slots. So one thing I've been doing, as I've kind of been coming up with suggestions for how, like, wub step aficionados can use my collection, is if you take the AI generated wavetables I was talking about, if you put them in there with the infinite clip on them, you get these like really great, like very high energy, like like square type of waveforms, but they'll have like these huge gaps in them because there's big differences between the different timbres inside of the wavetable, and they're like instant growls. They're like instant wub step growls. They're just like rah, rah, rah. So they're just really cool.
Yeah. And I suppose when you've got something on the Modwave, you've got the motion sequence, haven't you? So you can move to specific points or crossfade or whatever you want with that.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, then there's that. I mean, that's like a whole world. I have to say, like, in most of my demos and stuff, I don't really get into that. I've done a couple of patches that I've played in some of my other videos where there is motion sequencing going on. It's a really cool feature, right? And it does let you modulate anything. I don't enjoy using the Modwave version of that as much as the wave state. Like for some reason, there's something more appealing about how it works in wave state than in Modwave. And in Modwave, it's just a fantastic subtractive synthesizer all by itself. Like you don't have to get in. Well, I think a lot of your videos show this. Like you don't have to get into a lot of the crazy modulation lane stuff to get interesting sounds out of it. It's got all the architecture you need, to do all the classic synth and wavetable synth things without even getting into the modulation.
Yeah. So the wavetables you're creating, what are you finding that people are actually using for, like you said, some genres of music that lend themselves to it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so there are a lot, ambient, cinematic, things like that. Classic synthesis stuff, your bread and butter. There's so many waveforms that are in the collection that like you could substitute for a boring old sawtooth or a boring old square, things like that. I've had a lot of interest from sound designers, and I haven't debuted this officially, but I will probably have like a kind of a cheap and cheerful like independent sound designer license where for something like $100 you can license a certain number of wavetables to be included in a third-party product. That's kind of how this started. There was a product back in 2010. It's like the last time I think anyone made a huge collection of waveforms, and then eventually wavetables. But it was called Galbanum Architecture Waveforms. And it had like 25,000 waveforms in it. But this is back in 2010, and ones that really caught my ear were these bell-like tones of the polygonal number series, and there were only like a handful of waveforms from that. And so I'd been bothered for years about how can I make these? Like, how can I make these waveforms and like do more variations on them? And then like I finally learned how to do it, like kind of middle of last year. And once I had explored that, I was like, oh, well, let's just make all the other mathematical series waveforms that we can. So that's kind of what got me going on that. So there's but those were kind of hard to license, because when they originally debuted, the developer of those was kind of targeting like hardware synth manufacturers and software synth manufacturers and trying to license, this as like a technology. Whereas my approach has just been like, look, these are fairly easy to make. It just kind of takes my time. And so I've been talking with a couple of different sound developers about like, what's a reasonable price, and what would make it kind of easy, cheaper, and fun, while still making it worth my time. Because of course, you can't take my collection of waveforms and resell it, right? But there should be some kind of licensing for sound designers. So sound designers have been very interested in this, because a lot of, well, kind of the non like factory waveforms that come with things, most people are just kind of, when they're making wavetables, they might either be taking an existing audio sample and trying to turn that into a wavetable, which is difficult, and it's not always very successful, or they're just playing around in like Serum's formula parser, which is cool, because that is mathematical, and it'll create these kind of perfect waves. But it's rare that someone comes along and like just does a bunch of mathematically perfect waves, and so it's really people who are like really interested in deep sound design, I think, that have been turned on to this collection so far. But every time I do a YouTube video, I actually get new purchasers, and the free version has been like off the chain successful. I mean, in terms of generating a mailing list, like I have a humongous mailing list now. The trick is turning the free people into buyers. Like, hey, what would make this attractive to you? But it's the collection itself is for kind of sound explorers, and the idea and why I keep adding stuff to it is like, I'm on this like single cycle waveform adventure, right? And I want to take you along with me. And so even my stuff, so I'm never going to publish like absolute crap. But it's like, even if I think that something is not particularly useful, it might be useful to someone else. And so, I just do these deep dives on, okay, here's all the interesting stuff that we can make using this technique. Here's all the interesting stuff we can make using that technique. And then I make it part of the collection. And so at this point, it's bigger than like some orchestral sound libraries. It's many gigabytes in size now, but it's just little snippets of audio. So there's a lot.
That's the thing, isn't it? The gigabytes of samples might be, you can get a piano sample library that's in gigabytes for a single piano, but for wavetables being so tiny, that's an awful lot of wavetables.
No, that's the thing. Yes, it's an awful lot of wavetables.
And so where did anybody go to find these? And first of all, where did you go to get them? And I know you've got a YouTube channel where people actually listen and see the examples of what you're talking about.
Well, you can check them out. There's a free version. It's at wavetables.lol. That's wavetables.lol. Which is my Gumroad page. You'll find there's actually 3 products up there right now. You'll find like the free Wavetables collection. There's the commercial collection, which is ostensibly $29, but it's almost always on special because I'm still kind of trying to figure out the right pricing for that. So basically, if you try to, basically keep up with my YouTube channel, because almost every time I debut a new YouTube video, I put a coupon code in there. And then there's like I'm a big Eurorack guy, and so I have a collection of modular drum sounds that are completely free up there. And I might be introducing more stuff along those lines as new collections. I haven't really decided. Mostly my new work, it all goes into the KRC Math Waves collection, which is the commercial set.
Yeah, and I enjoy watching your videos with the sound, and you explain the wavetables and everything else, which is good. So I make sure I include those links in there, because they're a good introduction to wavetable and in general.
They're not too bad. I mean, I have to say, like, not all my videos are like amazing, but you know, I try to make them sound good, and people seem to like it. They do seem to like it.
Yeah.
You know.
And what kind of synths, other than you mentioned the Modwave, what other synths can you use these with?
Right. So I actually provide, so the entire collection is provided in 3 different formats. So originally, actually 4 different formats. So originally it was available for Modwave, as you say, and Modwave has its own, this bundle format. It's really handy because it's kind of like a zip archive, like everything's in the bundle and then you just import it into the synth. It was very cool. But also for Serum or Vital, which are VST synthesizers, also Pigments and Phase Plant would be in that category. Anything that supports 2048 sample per frame wave files as an import format, and that's most of the software synthesizers. But then it turned out that there's a popular open source synthesizer. I hate the look of it, but it does sound okay. It's called Surge XT. It has its own wavetable format that's not just wave. It's called .wt, and it has extra meta information in it that tells it, here's how many frames are in this file, and here's the length of the frames. So there's the WT format that you can use in Bitvig or Bitwig, however you like to say it, with their polymer synth. And then those also work with Surge XT. And then there's a whole bunch of either older hardware synthesizers, but mostly Eurorack modules that support wave edit format. So, and by wave edit, what I mean is it's a 256 sample per frame wave file where the waveforms are 16-bit rather than 32-bit in more modern sense. And so every single wavetable that I've done, I've converted both to WT and to that wave edit format. So literally, there's not really any wavetable synthesizer you can't use these with unless it doesn't support import. So yeah, it's like literally everything. Anything. Yeah. But like Serum and Vital are probably most popular. And then I had some early adopters who were like, I use Surge. And then I had to go like read their documentation and like figure out how to make .wt files. But that turned out to be beneficial because then they're usable in Bitwig. I don't know why Bitwig went with .wt format for wavetable import rather than, you know, the kind of simpler just 2048 samples per frame wave files. Like, why not do that? But I guess they have reasons.
Excellent. Well, that was fascinating, and it's like maths meets music meets computing. Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it, how it all comes together?
Yeah. Well, I enjoyed it.
I'll include the links in the show notes cool. for your website and your YouTube channel as well, so people can give those a try and get the free set, give it a try. And I've got some of your wavetables to put into my Modwave and start playing around with that. So my next on my list to do.
No, definitely, definitely check them out. You'll see what I'm talking about. You'll be like, oh wow, a lot of these are the same, but then you'll be like, oh wow, a lot of these are awesome.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, Keith, I really do appreciate you taking time out today to come on the show. That was really great. If anybody's got any questions, where's the best place to get you? On the YouTube channel comments? Or you get email?
Actually, I really like to interact with people there. That's probably one of the best ways to reach me is just to ask a question on one of the YouTube videos for sure, because I see all of them. Like every YouTuber, I'm obsessed with metrics, and so I see all the comments.
I know that. Gary knows that as well.
I try to respond.
Yeah, I know as well.
Excellent. Well, it was great talking to you. Great catching up, and I'm sure we'll talk again on a future show.
Yeah. That was really good.
It's always great when you get someone got a really enthusiast for a subject. The passion comes across. Yeah,
it really does come across. And it's an interesting subject. I mean, it's something I hadn't thought about, but it really is, because it's sort of stuff I do, but not for more for graphics than for sound. So
it's amazing. So, and there's so much stuff to download. So I definitely recommend checking those out. Right, well, that's us for this week. So we'll see you next week.
Yeah, take care.